and 10:45, if you can then come back, like take the presentation off and come back, and that should give us enough time to answer questions and close everything out. So, and then I can, because at the latest, I got to be on the other team. I have to be on a Teams platform by 10:50 because I have to set up for that talk that I'm doing at 10:50.
Do you think that because I don't want to make you troubles, but I am not sure if I will arrive. I don't want to run. What do you think?
No, I don't want you to rush. I just want you to,
Can we? I propose you something. Tell me if it can be okay. Let's say 5 minutes before you are seeing that we are at the latest moment. I have to finish 5 minutes before. You just interrupt me, and you're saying, Valentina, very interesting, but you are getting late. There are too many topics.
Okay, I can see if they can bring me on. I can have them bring me on at. It says I will tell when we are ready to start. He said, yeah, I will let you know. They'll let us know, and they'll bring me back on if it's running a little. But I want to make sure you do what you have to do to deliver everything you're delivering. And
I know, but I'm not sure that I will be able to be in time. So that's why I'm saying, if you are interrupting me, I will say, okay, let's jump to the conclusion, and I will cut the I don't know, the slides that are at the end, because it's the only way that we can do it. If we see that,
and actually, he's actually saying, let's go. He says, start right now. Are you ready to start right now?
Yes, I'm start. I can.
All right, yeah, we can start now. It gives you more time. So here we go. We're going to start right now. And we're going to give it up. We're going to start here. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome, everybody. I hope everyone is having a great week. And we are excited to have today's webinar that we're going to be talking about retail volatility and unstable decisions, the value of AI in modern strategic planning. And we want to make sure that everybody that is here, again, if you have questions, make sure to put those questions in the chat box. And that way we can make sure to have those answered for you. Today's webinar is going to roughly run until about 10:45 to 10:50 latest East Coast time. So we want to make sure if you've got questions, make sure they're ready. And today's webinar, we're going to be talking with Valentina Labate. She is the Chief Strategy Officer at Pita Rosso and Scarp & Scarp. And this webinar is going to be presented from her perspective. She was a retail fashion executive with extensive international experience in merchandising, planning, and business transformation across footwear and apparel. Throughout her career, she has led strategic growth, performance optimization, and organizational transformation projects for multi-brand retail businesses, combining strong commercial vision with data-driven decision-making and AI innovation. She is passionate about building scalable strategies that connect product, customer experience, and business results. And without further ado, we're going to welcome Valentina to the stage. Valentina, the stage is all yours, and feel free to share your screen and to enlighten us today on this valuable topic for those that are in retail that can get a lot of value from your section today.
Thank you. Thank you very so much. So, good morning, everyone. First of all, thanks for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here. And before we talk about artificial intelligence, I'd like to start with something much simpler. I'd like to start with a belief. Actually, a belief that I changed during my career. When I first started working in retail, I was convinced that the future would gradually become easier to predict. I thought that if we collect better data, improved forecasting, and invested in better planning, uncertainty would slowly disappear. Today, after many years working across merchandising, operations, and AI transformation, I believe something completely different. Better data doesn't eliminate uncertainty. Better technology doesn't eliminate uncertainty. Even AI doesn't eliminate uncertainty. What really changes is the quality of our decisions. And for me, this is the real conversation. Today isn't really about AI. AI is simply one of a much bigger picture. Today is about something every retail leader experiences every day. How do we continue making good decisions when the environment refuses to become predictable? Because I honestly believe this is becoming one of the biggest leadership challenges in retail. Not technology, not algorithms, decision-making. Everything we'll discuss today, planning, alignment, AI, is simply another way of improving how organizations make decisions. So let's begin with the very simple question. What has actually changed? To answer that, I'd like to use a metaphor that has followed me for quite some time. Retail today reminds me of sailing in the open ocean, not because it's a beautiful metaphor, because I think it's surprisingly accurate. Think about a captain. Every morning, he leaves the harbor. Does he control the wind? No. Does he control the waves? No. Does he control the weather? No. Does he control the currents? No. So, what exactly does he control? He controls the destination. He decides where the ship is going. He leads the crew. And throughout the journey, he continuously adjusts the sails. I believe leadership in retail works exactly the same way. Every week, something changes. Sometimes every day. Consumer behavior changes. Promotional pressure changes. Competitors change. Inflation changes. Supply chains changes. Consumer confidence changes. When I started leading planning and AI transformation projects, I found this incredibly frustrating because I was looking for stability. Every planner wants stability. They want forecasts to be accurate. They want plans to remain valid. And we want the environment to behave consistently. But reality doesn't work like it anymore. One of the biggest lessons I learned was understanding that planning isn't about protecting the original plan. Planning is about helping the organization to adapt without losing direction. That completely changed the way I think about planning. That's why I see these three concepts here shown as having completely different responsibilities. Strategy answers one question: where do we want to go? Planning answers another question: how do we get there? AI answers a third question: how do we continuously adjust while everything around us keeping changing? These three are not interchangeable, and I think many organizations still expect one of them to do the job of the others. Sometimes companies expect AI to define strategy. It can't. Sometimes they expect planning to eliminate uncertainty. It can't. Sometimes they expect strategy to solve operational problems. Again, it can't. And understanding those different roles is where better decisions begin. Which brings us to another question. If the environment has changed so dramatically, shouldn't the way we make decisions change as well? And to understand why, we first need to understand how retail itself has changed. So, what has actually changed? We often say the retail has become more complex. Personally, I don't use this word anymore. I think complexity is no longer the right description. I prefer another word, instability. And there is a very important difference. Complex systems eventually became predictable. Unstable systems don't. Let me ask you a question. How many of you started this year with a commercial plan that remained exactly the same until today? Probably none. 20 years ago, that wasn't so unusual. Today, it would almost be impossible. Did planners suddenly become less capable? I don't think so. Did forecasting become worse? No. Did retailers suddenly stop understanding their customers? Again, I don't think so. The environment changed. And once the environment changes, everything else has to change as well. Forecasting changes, planning changes, leadership changes, even the role of AI changes. Think about what has happened over the last few years. Consumer behavior changes much faster. Product life cycle becomes shorter. Competitors react almost immediately. Promotional calendars change continuously. Global events suddenly become local business problems. And these things don't happen one after another. They happen simultaneously. That's what makes today's retail environment fundamentally different. One event is manageable. 10 events interacting together are something completely different. That is why I no longer describe retail as complex. I describe it as structurally unstable. And once we accept that, we stop looking for perfect plans. We start building organizations that adapt faster. Because maybe speed is no longer the real competitive advantage. Maybe adaptability is. One lesson I learned while leading planning teams was that our first forecast almost never turned to be the final one. At the beginning, I considered that a failure. Today, I consider it perfectly normal. The value wasn't producing the perfect forecast. The value was recognize change early and helping the organization adapt faster than competitors. that completely changed the way I think about planning. And once we accept that, another question naturally follows. If uncertainty has become permanent, what should leaders focus on? This is probably one of my favorite ideas in the entire presentation. No destination, no direction. Because I believe many transformation projects begin with the wrong question. They ask, how can AI optimize faster? How can we automate more? How can we improve efficiency? These are all important questions, but they are not first questions. The first question is much simpler. Where do we want actually to go? Technology is incredibly good at accelerating movement, but technology doesn't decide direction. Leadership does. And I think this distinction is becoming more important than ever, because the better technology becomes, the more important leadership becomes, not less, more. Imagine giving the most advanced navigation system in the world to someone who hasn't decided where they want to go. Will the journey become better? No. It will be simply become faster in the wrong direction. And organizations sometimes do exactly the same thing. They invest millions in technology before aligning on business priorities, before agreeing on success metrics, before defining trade-offs. The results, everyone works harder, everyone produces more, everyone becomes more efficient, but not necessarily more effective, because they are moving quickly, but without moving together. And that is a leadership problem, not a technology problem. One thing I experienced several times was that the technology wasn't the difficult part. The difficult part was getting different functions to agree on what success actually meant. Marketing had one definition, finance had another, planning had another, supply chain, again, another. The algorithm wasn't confused, the organization was, and that realization completely changed the way I approach transformation projects. Today, before discussing algorithms, I always start with another question. What are we really trying to optimize? Because once that answer becomes clear, technology becomes much easier. Once the destination becomes clear, planning suddenly becomes much more valuable, not less, which brings us to another misunderstanding I encounter very often, the idea that planning becomes less important when uncertainty increases. In my experience, the opposite is true. So, if uncertainty has become permanent, what should organizations do? One reaction I have observed many times is actually reducing planning. It almost sounds logical. If the future is unpredictable, why spend time planning? Have you ever heard that? I certainly yes, not once. But over the years, I reached exactly the opposite conclusion. The more uncertainty increases, the more planning becomes important. Why? Because planning was never about predicting one future. Planning is about preparing the organization for multiple possible futures. That's a completely different mindset. Forecasting asks, what do we think will happen? Planners ask, are we ready if we have to face changes? Because uncertainty doesn't reduce the value of planning. It changes the purpose. Planning stops being a prediction exercise. It becomes a decision framework, a way of helping people react consistently when reality inevitably changes. One lesson I learned leading planning teams is that nobody ever expected the first plan to be perfect. The real value came later. How quickly could we recognize that something had changed? How quickly could we understand the impact? And most importantly, how quickly could the organization move together? That is where planning creates value. Not on the day we publish the forecast, but on the day reality proves the forecast wrong, because that day always comes. But planning alone, it isn't enough, because even the best plan fails if every department follows a different direction. This brings us to another challenge. And honestly, I think this one is much more harder than technology, alignment. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a meeting where everyone around the table was right and the final decision was still wrong? I have many times, because every function was optimizing something different. Procurement wanted lower costs. Merchandising wanted better assortment. Logistics wanted operational efficiency. Finance wanted stronger margins. Marketing wanted sales growth. Every objective made perfect sense individually. Collectively, they often pulled the organization in different directions. And this is something I learned very early. Organizations don't become ineffective because people make bad decisions. They become ineffective because people make good decisions using different objectives. Because that data doesn't solve the problem. Technology doesn't solve the problem. Leadership does. Leadership decides which objective matters most when objectives start competing. One of the most interesting experiences I had during transformation projects was discovering that people rarely disagreed with the data. The numbers were not the problem. The disagreement was somewhere else. What should we optimize? Sales, margin, availability, inventory? Each answer was reasonable. Each answer created different consequences. That was the real discussion. And And that's why today, before talking about algorithms, I always ask another question. What decision are we actually trying to improve? Because until that becomes clear, technology simply makes disagreement faster. And once every department starts making decisions independently, another consequence appears very often: fragmentation. People ask often me, what is the biggest challenge in retail today? Interestingly, my answer is rarely AI, it's rarely technology, it's rarely data. My answer is usually fragmentation. Data is fragmented, processes are fragmented, systems are fragmented, and eventually decisions become fragmented. Think about what happened inside a typical organization. Commercial teams look at one dashboard. Finance looks at another. Supply chain uses different metrics. Planning works with different assumptions. Everybody is looking at the same business, but not through the same lens. And something very interesting happens. The organization becomes slower, not because people work slow, but because alignment takes time, and alignment becomes more expensive than analysis itself. This is one of the biggest hidden costs inside modern organizations, not analysis, coordination. One of the most valuable projects I ever worked on wasn't building another dashboard. It wasn't introducing another KPI. It was helping different functions look at the business through the same decision framework. Something unexpected happened. Meetings became shorter. Conversation became clearer. People challenged assumptions instead of challenging numbers. That changed the quality of decision much more than introducing another report. And for me, that it's one of the most underestimated values of AI. Not automation, alignment. So, if fragmentation is the real problem, what exactly is the role of AI? Is it simply another automation tool, or can it fundamentally change how organizations make decisions? That's where I'd like to go next. So far, we have talked about why decision-making has become more difficult. Now, I'd like to introduce the role of AI. And I'd like to start by challenging another common assumption. Many organizations still think about AI as a technology project or as another automation tool. Personally, I don't. I think automation is only the first step. The real value of AI begins when it helps us improve decisions. That's why I like to describe AI as a decision system, not simply a software application, not a dashboard, not a chatbot, a decision system. Because the maturity of AI evolves through different stages. At the first level, AI automates repetitive activities. This is where many organizations start. They save time, reduce manual work, increase efficiency, and that's valuable. But in my opinion, that's only the beginning. The second level is much more interesting. AI starts connecting information that normally remains disconnected. It identifies patterns, relationships, dependencies, things that become very difficult for people to recognize. Things not because people don't see them, but because it is really difficult to do it. And finally, there is the third level, the strategic level. This is where AI starts helping leaders evaluate different scenarios, not by replacing judgment, but by expanding it. It helps us ask, what happens if we choose this path instead of another? And for me, that's where AI becomes transformative. Not because it predicts the future, because it allows leaders to evaluate uncertainty with much greater confidence. This is why I don't see AI as an automation project. I see it as a decision capability, and that distinction changes everything. One of the biggest shifts in my own thinking happened when I realized that the value of AI wasn't measured of how many tasks it automated. It was measured by how many better conversations it created. When people started discussing decisions instead of discussing spreadsheets, I knew the transformation was working. And once we start looking at AI as a decision system, something very interesting happens. We begin to see things that were previously invisible. AI reveals the invisible. This is probably one of my favorite ideas because it completely changed the way I think about data. For many years, analytics answered one question: what happened? And that's important. But let me ask you something. Is knowing what happened yesterday enough to make tomorrow's decisions? Usually not. Traditional analytics is like looking in a rear view mirror. It tells us where we have been. AI adds something different. It starts identifying what is emerging, weak signals, unexpected relationships, patterns that are still too small for us to notice. And that's incredibly valuable in retail because retail rarely changes at once. It changes gradually, store by store, category by category, size by size, week by week. The challenge is that by the time those changes become obvious, they have often already affected the business. AI helps us notice them earlier, not because it predicts the future perfectly, no, but because it detects change earlier than traditional analysis. That gives leaders something incredibly valuable: more time to understand, more time to decide, more time to react. And in today's retail environment, time is probably the most valuable competitive advantages. One lesson I learned is that AI rarely tells you something completely unknown. More often, it tells you something you already suspected, but couldn't prove with confidence. And that confidence makes decisions much easier to share across the organization. This slide summarizes what I believe is one of the greatest strengths of AI: visibility. Not prediction, visibility. Every organization has data. The question is, can we actually see what matters? AI helps us in three different ways. First, it detects weak signals, small changes that individually may seem irrelevant, but together indicate that something new is happening. Second, it identifies hidden anomalies. Sometimes aggregated reports look perfectly normal, but underneath, one store, one product, or one customer segment is already behaving differently. Without AI, these signals often remain invisible. Third, AI connects variables that people rarely analyze together. Not because we don't know how to do it, simply because these are too many possible relationships. And this is where AI becomes a real partner for decision making. Not because it replaces human experience, because it expands our ability to see. For me, this is one of the biggest mindset shifts. The objective of AI isn't finding the answer. The objective is making sure leaders ask better questions, because better questions almost always lead to better decisions. Up to this point, we have seen that AI can reveal things that traditional analytics simply cannot see. But there is another lesson that, in my experience, is even more important. Many organizations are eager to optimize. As soon as they identify an opportunity, they immediately ask, how can we improve this KPI? It's a natural reaction, but it can also be a dangerous one, because optimization without understanding often means optimizing the wrong thing. That's why I really like the sequence shown in this slide. Everything starts with data. Data alone has no meaning. It simply records what happened. The next step is insight. This is where AI creates value. It connects information, identifies patterns, highlights anomalies. It helps us understand why something is happening. Only then we can move to the third step, decision. This is the moment where human judgment becomes essential. AI can generate insights, but leaders decide priorities. Finally, action. And that's where value is actually created, not when we collect data, not when we build dashboards, only when better decisions become better actions. One project made this very clear for me. Every Monday, we had access to a huge amount of information. The problem wasn't the lack of data. The problem was understanding where to focus first. Without diagnosis, teams spent hours analyzing everything. Once AI started identifying the most relevant signals, people stopped asking, where should I look? And started asking, what should we do? That is exactly the transition shown in this slide, moving from data to insight, to decisions, to action. And once organizations begin making the transition, AI starts creating a completely different type of value, not simply visibility, real business value. Everything we have discussed so far leads naturally to this slide, because seeing more is valuable only if it helps us to decide better. For me, AI creates value through 4 progressive capabilities. The first is exactly where we started: reveal the invisible, weak signals, hidden anomalies, relationships. But visibility alone isn't enough. The second capability is diagnosis. Before optimizing anything, we need to understand what is actually causing the problem. Otherwise, we simply automate mistakes. The third capability is something I experience repeatedly in retail: optimize composition, not only volume. This is particularly important in merchandising and replenishment. Having more inventory doesn't necessarily mean having the right inventory. Sometimes the total quantity is perfectly adequate, yet customers still cannot find the product they want, because composition matters more than volume. Finally, there is the fourth capability, perhaps the most important one: define the right objective. AI is incredibly powerful, but it optimizes exactly what we ask it to optimize. Nothing more, nothing less. Which means leadership has a completely new responsibility: defining the right success metrics, choosing the right constraints, making explicit the trade-offs the organization is willing to accept, and that is not a technical decision, it's a business decision. Let me show you a real example of what looks like in practice. So far, we have talked about concepts. Now, I'd like to show you what those concepts look like in a real business situation. This is one of the projects that changed the way I think about inventory management. At first glance, everything looked perfectly healthy. Our reports show adequate inventory. Coverage were positive. There were no critical alerts. From a traditional reporting perspective, there was no obvious problem to solve. But stores kept reporting missed sales. Customers couldn't find the products they wanted. That seemed like a contradiction. How could inventory be healthy while customers were leaving empty-handed? The answer was surprisingly simple. The problem wasn't the amount of inventory. The problem was where the inventory was. AI allowed us to move beyond aggregate numbers. Instead of asking, do we have enough stock? We started asking, do we have the right sizes in the right stores at the right moment? and suddenly the picture changed completely. The reports were telling us that inventory was available. AI revealed that the most requested sizes were missing, while slower moving sizes were accumulating across the network. In other words, our inventory wasn't wrong. It was simply distributed in the wrong way. That insight completely changed the conversation. We stopped discussing inventory volume and start discussing inventory composition. That experience led us to another important realization. If availability depends on composition, then optimizing total inventory is no longer enough. We have to optimize composition itself. Customers don't buy inventory. Customers buy availability. And availability depends on having the right product in the right store at the right moment in the right size. That's why I believe composition is often more important than quantity. The total stock may look perfectly healthy, but if best-selling sizes are missing, the customer still leaves the store without buying. At the same time, slow-moving sizes continue occupying space and capital. Traditional reporting struggles to detect this level of granularity. AI doesn't. It allows us to optimize 3 dimensions: product, location, and timing. And when those 3 dimensions start working together, sellability improves naturally. One of the biggest mindset changes during our replenishment project was moving away from asking how much stock do we have to asking, is the stock actually sellable? That single question completely changed the discussion. But improving composition is only one part of the story. Another area where AI creates enormous value is markdown optimization. This project taught me one of the most important lessons of my career. At first sight, markdown optimization seemed straightforward. Reduces prices, increases room, reduce inventory, everyone wins. And in short term, that's often exactly what happens. KPIs improve, inventory decreases, cash flow improves, everything looks successful. But there is another side of the story. Every optimization creates consequences. Lower prices today may reduce pricing flexibility tomorrow. Customers may become more promotion sensitive. Future margins may become harder to protect. This is why I call it a paradox, because optimization is never free. Every improvement has a trade-off. And one of the responsibilities of leadership is deciding which trade-off is acceptable. AI doesn't eliminate those trade-offs. It simply makes them much more visible. The difficult part wasn't building the model. The difficult part was agreeing on success, which naturally leads to another question. If every optimization creates trade-offs, how do we decide which objective AI should optimize? These slides summarize what I believe is one of the biggest misconceptions about AI. People often think the quality of AI depends mainly on algorithm. In reality, it depends first on the objective. AI is incredibly disciplined. It optimizes exactly what we ask to optimize. Nothing more, nothing less. If the objective is incomplete, the recommendation will also be incomplete. If the success metric is wrong, AI will efficiently optimize the wrong outcome. That's why I believe defining the objective function is fundamentally a leadership responsibility, not an IT responsibility, not a data science responsibility. It's a business responsibility. Because before asking, can AI solve this problem, leaders should ask, have we correctly defined the problem? This is much more difficult question, but it is also the most important one. And once objectives become explicit, another reality immediately appears. Business decisions are rarely about optimizing a single KPI. This is probably one of the ideas I use most often today. Retail is full of competing objectives. We all want revenue growth, but sometimes revenue reduces margin. We all want lower inventory, but sometimes lower inventory reduces availability. We all want greater efficiency, but sometimes efficiency reduces flexibility. The important point is this: none of these objectives is wrong. The mistake is belief they can always be optimizing simultaneously. Real leadership begins when we explicitly manage those tensions instead of pretending they don't exist. This is exactly why I find AI so interesting, not because it removes complexity, because it forces us to make trade-offs visible. Once those trade-offs become transparent, organizations have much better conversations. Not easier conversation, better conversations. Because people stop defending functions and start discussing enterprise value. Everything we have discussed so far, better objectives, better trade-offs, better alignment, ultimately leads to one bigger question. How do we make this way of thinking repeatable? Not once, not during one successful project, but every single day across the entire organization. If I had to summarize everything we have discussed so far into one sentence, it would probably be this: the real objective isn't building better AI. The real objective is building better decision systems. And I believe there is an important difference, because one successful decision doesn't change an organization. One successful project doesn't change an organization. Even one successful AI implementation doesn't change an organization. Organizations change when good decisions become repeatable, when they stop depending on one talented individual or one exceptional project or one department, and instead they become part of the way the business naturally operates. That is what I mean by a sustainable decision system. A system where people, processes, data, and technology work together consistently, not perfectly, consistently, because consistency creates trust. Trust creates adoption, and adoption creates business value. Looking back, I think this is one of the biggest lessons I learned. AI doesn't create transformation. It creates the possibility of transformation. The transformation happens only when organizations redesign the way decisions are made. Every Monday, every planning cycle, every replenishment review, every markdown discussion. That's when AI stops being a project and starts becoming an organizational capability. Even with the right decision system and the right data, one critical element still determines success: people. Because transformation only becomes real when people change the way they make decisions. Organizations don't transform when people understand the new process. They transform when the new process becomes the normal way of working together. As come to the end of today's discussion, I'd like to ask you one final question. If you had to remember only 3 ideas from everything we have talked about today, what should they be? For me, the first one is this: retail hasn't simply become more complex. It has become more volatile, and that changes the role of leadership. Because when the environment changes continuously, our competitive advantage no longer comes from having a perfect plan. It comes from adapting faster without losing direction. That's why planning remains so important, not because it predicts the future, but because it helps organizations navigate uncertainty. The second idea is that AI should never be evaluated only as a technology investment. Throughout today's examples, replenishment, markdown optimization, decision support, we have seen that the greatest value of AI isn't automation. Its greatest value is improving the quality of business decisions, helping people understand situations earlier, evaluate alternatives better, and align more quickly around the right decisions. That's the AI I believe in. Not AI replacing people, AI making organizations smarter. And finally, there is one lesson that probably surprised me more than any other. The success of AI has very little to do with the sophistication of algorithms. It has everything to do with the organization around it. Shared objectives, reliable data, the willingness to trust recommendations, and above all, alignment. Because when organizations are aligned, technology accelerates progress. When they're not, technology simply accelerates confusion. For me, those are the 3 ideas worth taking home today, not because they are about AI, but because they are about building organizations that consistently make better decisions. And with those 3 ideas in mind, I'd like to leave you with one final reflection. When I opened today's session, I used the metaphor of sailing in the open ocean. And I'd like to finish exactly there, because after everything we have discussed today, I believe the metaphor is even more meaningful. No captain controls the wind. No retailers controls uncertainty. Markets will continue to change. Customers will continue to surprise us. Technology will continue to evolve. That isn't going to stop. But good captains don't wait for perfect conditions. They learn how to navigate changing conditions. I believe organizations should do exactly the same. Planning gives us direction. Data gives us visibility. AI extends our ability to understand complexity. But in the end, every important decision is still made by people. And perhaps that's the real message I'd like to leave with you. Technology will continue to evolve, but organizations that learn to make better decisions together will always have an advantage. It's been a pleasure sharing these ideas with you today.
Thank you, Valentina. Thank you so much. I know we have a hard stop here very soon, so we're just going to see if we can answer just a couple questions here. Let's just take a look at, let me see. Actually, I can't see the questions. I had to log back in, so there were some questions that came in. Can you see the questions, Valentina? It's in the. We're going to have time to answer one question. Yeah, and I'm looking. It's not showing up on my chat for some reason.
I don't see them from my side.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not seeing them either. Okay, here we go. Just real quick, we have one time to answer one question. What was the biggest lesson you learned from markdown optimization projects?
Yes, what I explained during my session. The point is understanding which is the priority of the company. So it means understanding which is the objective that has to be taken. Because if we don't have clear the objective, the optimization will never be a success for all the functions inside the company.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time today, sharing this valuable information. It was very, very helpful. We want to thank the listeners that tuned in. We encourage everybody that was here listening on LinkedIn to reach out to Valentina. Feel free to reach out and connect with her, address any questions, further questions that you may have from her. We would also like to hear your feedback also in the LinkedIn comments as to what was shared today in terms of the value that you received. I know I did, and there was so much valuable nuggets that Valentina shared. So please take time to do that and leave those comments for us. We're going to be back at in the future here, probably in another month or so, with another webinar. We'll bring someone, another subject matter expert like Valentina in to share their wisdom and insights to another critical area that in this segment that has to be addressed. We want to thank you again for attending. And Valentina, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule.
Thank you to you. Thank you to you. Bye, everyone. Goodbye.
Take care, everybody.